Okay. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. The names that are popping up and some of your faces are from every continent, so we're in every time zone, which is not surprising to me given our esteemed panel and given the topic today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganyahaga Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Jojage Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. So I'm very happy to welcome you all. I'm Margie Mandel, the director of the Karl Polanyi Institute. And I'd like to welcome back our US politics panel. The Institute now has a resident US politics panel, if we could call it residency, a virtual residency. Fred Block, professor of sociology at the University of California at Davis. Margaret Peggy Summers, professor of sociology and history at the University of Michigan. Robert Kuttner, co-founder and editor of the American Prospect and professor at Brandeis University. And Duncan Cameron, our moderator today, President Emeritus, Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives and Rabbles, and also professor of political economy at University of Ottawa. I guess for all of us, regardless of what part of the world we're in, it has been really an emotional roller coaster, not to say a political roller coaster. I said just before we started that we would have a very different discussion had we had hosted this panel about 6 or 7 weeks ago. The landscape, the mood, prospects have changed. Can you please, everybody, turn off your
Yeah,
microphone?
sort of.
So I'm going to
I'm
hand
not
over.
too high.
Please turn off microphones, everyone. I'm going to hand it over to Duncan. We have approximately 1 hour for Duncan and the panelists to engage in a conversation on the current state of US politics and the upcoming election, and there will be time afterwards for some Q&A. You'll be invited to enter your questions and comments into the chat. So Duncan, I'm handing it over to you. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Thank you very much, Margie. I'm delighted that the Polanyi Institute has taken this initiative. The Polanyi Institute is, a creation of marvelous Margie and Carrie Levitt, and it has attracted people who see the limits of Keynesian economics as a way of organizing society, or of academic neo-Marxism, or of Swedish social democracy, and are looking for another transformative sort of home, another way of thinking about the world. And it's interesting how successful it's been and how many interesting people it's drawn. Fred Block from the beginning is here. As Canadians, we look out at the American election scene, and this is a great spectacle for which we have a front row seat. But for Americans, it's could have major implications for the quality of life of all their citizens. And given the spillover effects of the United States on other countries, which we're well aware of in Canada, it will have an impact on all our lives around the world at some level. Difficult always to imagine how much, but in some cases it can be very significant. I've watched a bit of the campaign so far, and Donald Trump has given up all discussion of anything other than an attempt to destroy Kamala Harris, the vice president, her legitimacy and her person. And it looks like in this case, he's picked up on Pierre Poilievre, which he's been trying to do the same thing with Justin Trudeau for the last year. So, but rather than focus on the race, the horse race aspect, I'm going to call her Peggy Summers, because she'll call other people will call her that. Peggy Summers and I were discussing this and the difference between a horse race and what's at stake in this election. And so I'm going to ask Peggy to begin with a discussion of what is at stake in this election and how can we frame the discussion, and is there something in Karl Polanyi that will help us to frame this discussion? Peggy, please begin.
Thank you, Duncan. Yeah, I wanted to, well, this distinction between the odds and the stakes is a dichotomy that was made familiar to us all by a famous media analyst, Jay Rosen at NYU. And it was meant to be a chastisement of the American media, who always deals in terms of the horse race, the odds, the polls, et cetera. And he chastised them. Look, focus on the stakes. What are the consequences? I think it's important to recognize that it's a porous boundary between the two, because what people perceive as the stakes is obviously going to affect who they're going to vote for. But trying to think about what is at stake, and because this is a Polanyi-sponsored event, I wanted to put out a provocation that we might want to think about this in Polanyian terms of fascism. We all know that what's motivating so many of us on the left is a terror of Trumpian fascism. And so why not turn to Polanyi, who gave us the classic Polanyian analysis of fascism. And for those of you who may not be familiar with it, he basically argued that in the late 20s and early 30s in Europe, that the turn to fascism only became inevitable, or what he would say almost inevitable, in the face of an impasse between, on the one side, the parliamentary democracies that were trying to institute some economic reforms to lessen the suffering of people who were losing jobs and suffering enormously under the Great Depression. On the one side, democratizing forces of the economy, and on the other side, global capital, which was organized around the gold standard, which is very much like today's globalization regime, which was absolutely resolutely committed to austerity. And he argued that in the face of this impasse between the two, that capital made a fateful decision. They were not necessarily inherently fascist, but in the face of the threat of having to relinquish some serious controls, that they chose authoritarianism and they chose state power, despite or at the price of, excuse me, I'm getting a message saying I've switched to French. Is that true?
No.
Okay. It says it sounds like you might have switched to a different language. That's news to me. Okay. So to regain my thought, okay, at the price of what Polanyi said, the extirpation of democracy, they chose fascism. In the United States, that didn't happen. They were stopped. But in Europe, that's what happened. Now, what I want to suggest is that up until now, the Democratic left has hardly represented any real threat to capitalism. On the contrary, Clinton, Obama, even Carter, these were all real neoliberal regimes, very much in line with capitalism. But something has shifted under the Biden administration. And however much he fell short of his perhaps FDR aspirations, Biden made some real halting attempts at what we can call a post-neoliberal shift in the economy. And this is most epitomized in his industrial policy, in the seriously trying to enforce antitrust, anti-monopoly, and supporting unions. The indication that I have that there's something echoing what happened in the 30s is two things. One is that in the spring, what we saw was large numbers of billionaires, both Wall Street billionaires and the Silicon Valley, one after another. These were people, men mostly, who had all come out against Trump after January 6th, vociferously renounced Trump. Never again, we're not standing with Trump. 3.5 years later, they have all fallen into line and again, vociferously come out and said, we're with Trump. They completely reversed. And what we saw, and many quotes, is essentially boils down to that the threat from the left in their mind of some kind of real constraint on their power was far more threatening to them than any threat to democracy posed by Trump. This has often been seen as a tipping point in analyses of what can be seen as a marker in the shift towards authoritarianism. And it's an echo of when in Germany, the ruling conservatives decided that the threat from the left was far worse than the threat from the right, and they essentially handed over the regime to Hitler. I'm not suggesting that the left poses anything like what the left posed in Germany at the time, but there is something significant here going on. The second indicator I'll stop and we can talk more about this is the selection of Vance. I think it's been yes, he's a disaster, but the selection is what's significant, and that he represents a certain wing of what can be seen as a sort of homegrown American neo-fascist, allegedly pro-worker, pro-family. It's a religious nationalist, Catholic nationalism, a very specific kind of billionaire represented by Peter Thiel. I'm going to stop there and just frame that as a provocation to the rest of my panel. Do we think that we are in this kind of Polanyian fork in the road at this stage?
Bob, I know that the Democratic Party wants to deal with the issues that are facing Americans in their daily lives. And I wonder if you could, following up on Peggy, talk about some of the Harris economics and what kind of threat does the left actually present to capitalism, or what kind of benefits does it offer to the American public?
Well, I think Peggy's absolutely right that Biden and by extension Harris are the first stirrings of post neoliberalism on the part of the mainstream Democratic Party. I mean, the mainstream Democratic Party has moved toward the left. Some of this is the nature of the times, in the same way that Roosevelt, who started out not all that left wing, became more progressive because of the Great Depression. I think in Biden's case, it was partly the COVID recession and the need for a lot of public intervention. I also think it was the influence of Bernie Sanders, and particularly of Elizabeth Warren, who posed a very credible post-neoliberal set of policies that Biden found it expedient to adopt. And Warren in particular had an enormous amount of influence, both in terms of personnel and in terms of policy. So that's the good news. We've finally gotten over this, or we've begun to get over this period when the Democratic Party was captured by 3 neoliberal presidents in a row. But the problem is that, given the fact that working people have suffered declining income, declining status, declining security for something like 40 years, the period of globalization, the period of rampant capitalism, 4 years of somewhat better policies have not been enough to transform their sense of how well I'm doing. And it's still impossible to afford a home. It's still difficult to get a job that's not a gig. It costs a fortune in debt to go to college. And on top of that, and although inflation is down, people remember what prices were in 2019. And so Biden, and then by extension Harris, is caught in a situation where they're not transformative enough. And the effort to really housebreak capitalism once again, as we did in the 1930s, has really only begun. And I think the other Polanyian echo here is what happens when capitalism commodifies everything, and destroys the lives of ordinary people. And on top of that, you have the fact that a lot of ordinary people were white working class people. So simultaneously with their misfortune as the result of rampant global capitalism, you have Black people and women finally getting something of their due. And so on all three counts, you have a perception on the part of a lot of white working class people that they're downwardly mobile and they're disrespected, their status has declined. And I think in the same way that seeded fascism in the 30s, a kind of working class fascism, if you will, that has seeded the ground for Trump. And so people who feel that sense of grievance just look past the complete craziness that other people see when they see Trump and see him as the champion of their sense of grievance. And so the question is whether Harris and Walz is very important here, are good enough to overcome that. And I'll make one other point that's sort of related. It's a little horse racy, but what the heck. So the Democrats came out of the convention with all this energy, all this unity, and now it's a couple of weeks later, and the polls have scarcely budged. And so people say, well, what's going on here? And I think one of the things that's going on is that the potential Democratic electorate, the low propensity voter, has not yet been motivated, and polls are very lousy at picking that up, so that you've got, the party activists have been motivated. And I think the question is whether the party activists will do a good job of mobilizing the potential electorate. And that's what we still don't know. There's a political sciencey point here, which is whether the low voting propensity voter is more likely to vote Democrat when they vote, more likely to vote Republican. The conventional wisdom has been, up until Trump, that low propensity voters, when they vote, when they can be motivated and mobilized to vote, tend to favor Democrats, African Americans, young people. The counter to that is that Trump has also been very adept at motivating low propensity voters on the MAGA side, people who are disaffected with the whole political system. They tend to see a champion in Trump. So I guess to tie those two things together and relate it back to Peggy's challenge, the question is, which of the two candidates can speak to the sense of dislocation from very Polanyian excesses of capitalism that ordinary people feel, and be credible not just in their narrative, but in their proposed remedies?
Thanks, Bob. Fred, I wanted to ask you if you might want to elaborate a bit on the Trump sort of policy outcome likelihood. The Heritage Foundation have put together this Project 2050, and these disaffected voters, people suffering, don't know anything about it, but it certainly is something to whet the appetite of the billionaire class, perhaps. Do you want to say a few words about Project 2050?
Sure. It's Project 2025, but I did want to respond a little bit to the previous comments. I won't be as articulate as my colleagues here, but I guess the first point is that I agree with most of what was said, but I want to stress how divided the business class in the US is. In other words, that Peggy's right that there were these 10 or 15 billionaires who jumped on the Trump bandwagon after having been very critical of him and being critical of January 6th and so forth. But the vast majority of the corporate class are extremely worried about Trump. They're extremely worried about the about the kind of policies that he'll pursue, and they're extremely worried about the end to democratic governance. In other words, they've taken on board the message that that Trump will be an authoritarian leader, that the normal checks and balances won't work, and so their ability to influence policy will dramatically diminish. So there's a very deep split within the business class, and one of the manifestations of that is that the Trump campaign is underfunded relative to the Harris campaign. Part of it is that Trump diverts a very large chunk of the campaign contributions to his legal defense, which, because they're 6, 10, 12 different cases. I mean, he's paying, $1 million a week or more for legal fees. So that gets to be very, very costly. So the first is that there is this deep divide. The second point is that addressing Bob's point, where he's absolutely right that the real fundamental issue in the campaign is which candidate will respond to the aspirations of primarily white non-college voters. And here, the good news is that, Kamala is from the Bay Area where I am, and left-wing people here have always been extremely distrustful of her political positioning. She was historically, a classic corporate Democrat. When she was Attorney General, she did not distinguish herself for the most part in terms of her going after big business and so forth. So it's been an exhilarating surprise as to how much, since she became the candidate, she has embraced a kind of Bernie Sanders type of politics, of stressing the need to respond to the needs of ordinary working people. We saw her just on Labor Day giving a very strong pro-union speech. This is new, and it's encouraging in terms of her ability to, and on that point, a number of commentators have suggested that this is a change election. People are looking for change. Harris is really the incumbent, but she has, to some significant degree, flipped the switch on Trump and made Trump appear to be the incumbent, which is easier because Trump keeps saying that he really won the last election, so he is kind of the incumbent. That she's going to be, I think, introducing more of these policy proposals, which are all designed to suggest that she's going to produce even more economic change in the next administration. So the kind of core of Project 2025, the whole thing, it goes on for hundreds of pages. It's a kind of compendium, a right-wing wish list. But the core of it is the attack on the administrative state, that the core of it is essentially recognizing that Trump in the first term was restrained by civil servants, high-level political appointees who weren't really loyal to him. They blocked him from doing a lot of the things that he wanted to do. And at the core of what Project 2025 is doing is saying, we're going to attack the civil service, we're going to fire civil servants, we're going to staff the whole executive branch with political loyalists. And so when you take that with the Supreme Court horrendous immunity decision saying that the president's official acts are immune to any form of prosecution, that the combination of the gaining control of the executive branch and the impunity that the Supreme Court has granted means that Trump would be unconstrained in terms of his ambitions to deport millions of undocumented people. The kind of greatest terror is that that political repression against the left, against protesters, he would have a blank check to use the government apparatus, the military, to crush opposition. So that's the kind of core of what's so terrifying. Project 2025 also kind of details the social conservative wish list. They include outlawing mifepristone, the abortion pill, eliminating all of the remnants of affirmative action, diversity programs, anything that helps people of color, an increasing attack on gay people and trans people and so forth. So the prospects in that dimension, if they were to gain the presidency, are totally terrifying. I mean, that there's no bright side to that.
Peggy, do you want to talk a bit about the gender gap here and how important are the demographics in this election? I see that Trump has come out in favor of the anti-abortion legislation in Florida. And is that issue going to work against him as it's worked against his candidates in recent elections?
Yes, I will say something about that, and then I want to quickly go back to 2025. The thing, as feminists have been reminding us both over the last few days, to attack Trump on flip-flopping on abortion is completely a mistaken strategy. What Trump isn't flip-flopping, what he's doing is he's trying to deal with the fact that their actual abortion policy is deeply, horrifically unpopular. And he's just absolutely grabbing at straws to try to figure out how to pretend that what they have in mind is not what they are going to be doing. And that we should not, that it's the media, of course, gets caught by the shiny object of the flip-flopping on his position, that one day he says he's going to have the state support IVF, and the next day he says 6 weeks is too short. But, executing babies, after all, since that's what we Dems do, if that's the alternative, then he'll support the Florida, even though 6 weeks is too short. We shouldn't get waylaid by that. Nobody cares about hypocrisy. What matters is what is at stake with women's lives. I think that the gender gap there's no question that the gender gap is noticeable, is dramatic. What's even more dramatic is the way that young men, both as well as young men of color, are flocking to Trump, and that this is as much an election about what counts as masculinity as it is about protecting women's health. I personally wish they wouldn't keep using using choice, and would be focusing more on forced birth, and because choice has been used for 50 years, and it is not the right terminology. It's forced birth and essentially forced death in many cases. So we should be talking more about it in those terms. If I could quickly go back to 2025, the project, one very sort of interesting thing about it is that because it, exactly as Fred said, it's a model of restructuring the state, it's really about seizing the state it should put to rest once and for all this fantasy that neoliberalism is about small government, and that the right wing has always been about getting the government out of our lives, when in fact, in very Polanyian fashion, as Polanyi made clear absolutely explicitly, capitalism is about seizing state power for the interest of capital, and it has been all along. And so the bracing thing about 2025 is that it puts it out there. I also think that what the Democrats have done is the Harris campaign is has been quite effective. They've moved from blowing Trump up as being the great ogre and the great threat to democracy, and sort of belittling him, cutting him down to size, making fun of him, and yet blowing up Project 2025. In other words, deflating Trump, the man, and inflating the consequences, the stakes, by putting Project 2025 front and center. And so they've absolutely expanded our focus on what is really the consequence of Trump beyond him, the pathetic little insecure man. In Project 2025, it becomes clear that the judiciary is something that is not being focused on enough. I believe Bob wrote a column on this not too long ago. So it'd be good for you to talk about this more. But I think that what many call the juristocracy, the right-wing juristocracy, has become such that all democratizing efforts may just come to a dead end unless we can reform the judiciary. Yeah. There we go. I'll stop.
Bob, do you want to comment a bit on the courts, the judiciary? Unmute.
You're muted, Bob.
Hi there. Yeah, it's the judiciary. It's also broader than the judiciary. So one of the consequences of Trump is now a totally partisan court. And a court that, was willing not only to toss cases that put Trump at risk, but willing to issue this incredible pronouncement that basically anything the president does is legal, which makes literal Trump's famous or infamous comment of a decade ago that I could shoot somebody in Fifth Avenue, in the middle of Fifth Avenue, and nobody would care. So the court has made that literally true. And I think even though Harris and Walz may well win the election, in order for them to govern, they need to win the House and the Senate as well. And then there is a serious conversation that's long overdue about adding term limits or mandatory retirement age to the Supreme Court. That's statutory. It's not constitutional. The Supreme Court has had various sizes throughout American history. And I think this is both defensible and necessary because the court has become such a partisan institution. It's lost credibility. The Republicans have been shameless in turning it into a partisan institution. But both to redeem the courts and in order to be able to govern, Harris is going to need a majority in both houses, and as well as the presidency. Sorry to revert to horse race again. And that's possible. I mean, I wrote a column the other day about the fact that most voter suppression efforts have failed. You've got Democratic governors in 6 of the 7 states that are the swing states. And in the 7th state, you've got a Democratic governor, Kemp, in Georgia, who's completely at war with Trump and is trying to undo the efforts of a Trumpian majority on the state electoral commission. So there actually is a decent chance that she will hold the Senate, she will take the House, and then we can get to Supreme Court reform. But it's just a mark of how far American institutions have fallen. I mean, 10 years ago, a lot of political scientists were talking in a language about whether the guardrails will hold. Well, the guardrails, it was never a great metaphor, but I think the whole system of checks and balances that the constitutional founders took such care to create has really been pretty well undone. And this is going to be our last chance to repair it. So the courts are a very big part of that story because the courts, which were one institution that, often rose above party. I mean, right up until 2016, you had Republican appointed justices like Anthony Kennedy, not just behaving like partisan shills or like ideological right wingers. And now the court is divided into, a partisan majority of 6-3 with three ultra right wingers. And so it's a matter of redeeming democratic institutions across the board.
Brad, do you want to jump in on this question of electoral interference and the role of the courts or the administrative agencies that might intervene to sort of give us an unfair election result?
Well, I mean, I think that if the election is very close and it gets up to the Supreme Court, again, we can count on the partisan majority on the Supreme Court to give the election to Trump. I'm putting my money on that the margins in the key states, are substantial enough that that the lower courts won't intervene on the side of Trump, that it'll be a replay of 2020 where he lost 62 different cases. And in that event, I don't think that the Supreme Court, even with the partisan majority, I don't think that they will essentially overrule everybody and hand it to Trump, even though it was obvious that he lost. So I'm not worried about that particular scenario. I guess I want to go back to the kind of the initial point about what is the nature of the threat that has generated a possibility of a fascist authoritarian solution. And the way that I see it is that the U.S. has essentially avoided in the 8 decades since World War II the transition to a true multiracial social democracy, where there's a safety net that provides substantial protection from the population, where there significant regulation of the labor market that provides protections for ordinary people and so forth. And I think that's what's at stake in the election and in the authoritarian turn, because despite kind of Trumpian rhetoric that his opponents are socialists and communists and fascists and tyrannists and so forth, that what is motivating the right-wing elites to engage in the ferocious battle that they're engaged in is essentially the fear of social democracy, that once the U.S. makes a fuller transition in that direction, their power within the political system would be vastly diminished. So I think that's the motivating force, is the fear of the U.S. becoming much more similar to Canada in its kind of social infrastructure.
Peggy, do you want to say something about violence in the election process and the possibility of it?
Yes, and my favorite my favorite non-favorite topic. I think violence and the role of violence is underappreciated in multiple ways. There's just in fact, Bob's colleague, Rick Perlstein, just has I urge people to sign up to read The Infernal Triangle, which by Rick Perlstein at the American Prospect. He's always really, really good. And today's column is on the media, his favorite topic. And that's a whole nother discussion about the role the media is playing in this. I think it was last Friday or last week sometime when Trump was giving a rally, and he started doing his usual pointing in the back of the room at the press and attacking them as the enemy of the people. And some guy jumped out of the stands and started barging into the press and started going after, trying to grab on to assault the people in the media. And, you know, all the police and security started grabbing at him. And Trump says, "Oh, that's beautiful. That's really beautiful." And then he says to the crowd, "But it's okay. It's all okay because he's on our side. He's on our side." And this was Rick Perlstein's point was that this was not covered by one single newspaper except some tiny little newspaper in the 22nd paragraph. Now, some of it was carried somewhere because I think I saw it referenced on MSNBC or something. So I knew about it already, but it was not in any of the mainstream press. Apparently it was carried in Canada, in Alberta. There's a term that some of you may be familiar with. It's called stochastic terrorism. And essentially it means random acts of violence that have been incited by a political leader, in this case, Trump. And it is the stochastic nature of violence that is so terrifying to so many people. But it is also the systemic violence that is being both already not in the sense of a mass shooting, but what's going on in Texas, for example, where the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, is essentially invading people's homes, Latinos in this case, threatening them with taking away detaining them, taking away their computers, their phones, et cetera, essentially accusing them of election subversion, of election cheating. And by doing this and the publicity that it generates, terrifying the whole Latino population. And so, I mean, we can divide the election outcome process into two things: voter suppression and election sabotage. The first case, how do you keep people from the polls? And in the second case, once they've gone to the polls, how can you make sure that their votes aren't counted? And in both instances, I think violence plays a major part. There was a story today in The Guardian, top of the page in The Guardian, about a Christian nationalist group called something like the Roar of the Lion. I'd never heard of them before. And what they've done is they've recruited, so they call them election skeptics, which of course means Trumpians, MAGA people. And they're putting them into the role of election workers. In other words, the people that are sitting behind the desks. And this is a way to challenge. They will be challenging and sort of intimidating individuals as they come to try to vote. What we know is going on all over the country in red states is where they can get away with it is massive voter purging of the rolls. So people think that they're registered and they show up and their name is not there. There is this True the Vote, which is basically a bunch of right-wing thugs that come around and stand near the voting the drop boxes and intimidate people. There's just massive intimidation, especially affecting, I think, the Latino population for fear of deportation, even though they may be citizens. And then there's the election subversion, which is what, January 6th was the apex of it, but it happens in all these red counties. So even in a state like Michigan, my state, which is happily run by three amazing, wonderful Democratic women, there are these red counties where the election MAGA type people are going to be the ones certifying the vote. And again, threatening violence at all if their way of doing the counting doesn't and being able to decide whether the vote is going to be certified. All of this is done under this kind of shadow, this umbrella of the threat of violence. And I think it's underappreciated in terms of its potential effect.
Another subject I wanted to bring up, Marjorie Cohen mentioned in the question, is foreign policy. My colleague Jean Locke explained to me some time ago that foreign policy is not going to be an electoral issue, but it's perhaps a truism. But certainly the issue of Gaza, the ethnic cleansing that's going on, is a concern to people around the world. And I wonder if, Bob, do you want to comment on this, to the extent to which it's going to affect the Harris campaign or the election in general?
Yeah, I do. Unfortunately, Biden grew up in an era when Israel was a social democratic, good guy state, and that's the image of Israel that he carries around with him. And you add that to the political influence of the Israel lobby in the United States. So Biden has, practically invited Netanyahu to play him for a fool. And he keeps saying, gee, I wish they'd be a little less brutal with the Gazan civilians. And of course, Netanyahu laughs at him, and Netanyahu keeps saying, gee, we might have a deal, but then keeps moving the goalposts so that they don't get a deal. And when Netanyahu runs for re-election, his pitch is going to be, I'm the guy who saved you from pressure from the Americans. And unfortunately, that's the legacy that Biden has passed on to Harris. It's kind of a third rail issue. She has been a little tiny bit better in humanizing the brutality, making Palestinians more like human beings and being clear that this is horrible what Israel is doing in Gaza, but she's not changing the policy. And I think one of the really shameful things was that at the Democratic Convention, there were two Palestinian Americans who were prepared to speak, and the speeches were very tame. They combined a sense of regret and loss and grieving for their countrymen and relatives in Palestine with a plea that everybody should unite and support the Harris Walz ticket, because Biden has made it clear that he hates Muslims. So why should anybody who cares about Gaza vote for, not Biden, Trump, that he hates Muslims? So why should anybody who cares about this issue vote for Trump? Because Trump is incalculably worse, and Trump is also trying to outdo the Democrats as a philo-Semite, which is preposterous because all of his allies are anti-Semites. So he's wrapping himself in the mantle of Israel. And the far-right Christian Zionists are basically pro-Zionist because just before they all go to hell, the Jews are supposed to take over the Holy Land. I mean, it's completely, it's the rapture. It's completely hypocritical. And yet, because criticism of Israel's actions under Netanyahu has gotten conflated with anti-Semitism. I mean, if anything, Netanyahu has engendered more anti-Semitism than anybody in a very long time. And so as a consequence of this, Harris seems reluctant to touch this issue. And when I talk about the fact that it was shameful that the people who were running the Democratic National Convention refused to let two Palestinian Americans speak, it would have been so good for everybody. It would have been good for Michigan, where there are, I don't know, 150, 160,000 Muslim Americans. It would have been good for the soul of the Democratic Party to say that we're not afraid to let Palestinian Americans speak. It would have been a good signal to send Netanyahu. And if the Israel lobby didn't like it, too bad. But they're so averse to touching this issue that they wouldn't even let that happen. Now, the question of how much the election is going to turn on this, I don't think all that much, mainly because Trump is that much worse. But I really wish that Harris were better on it. I think Ukraine, I think the traditional Republican foreign policy establishment is pretty much in the same place as the Biden-Harris administration is, but it's never good for an incumbent president when there is an interminable war. And I guess the best thing he can say is that, well, at least it's not Americans who are getting killed, but the policy has not been successful. And so you've got two interminable wars on the Democratic Party's watch. One of them where the Democratic Party, in the person of President Biden, has blood on its hands because we've been supplying Netanyahu with all these weapons. All of that said, I don't think this is going to be a very major factor in the election, even in Michigan, where at least Harris is not Biden. And some Muslim Americans and Palestinian Americans who've been quoted in Michigan have said that they're somewhat friendlier to Harris than they were to Biden.
Fred, do you want to comment on this or any of the other foreign policy issues?
Well, I agree with much of what Bob said. I don't think that it's going to have much weight in the election. I also am a bit more optimistic that Harris, if elected, would shift the policy. I mean Biden's inability to put real pressure on Netanyahu is obviously, rooted in his own biography and historical experience with Israel. And it seems to me that from the point of view of U.S. foreign policy more generally, that it's so completely obvious that Netanyahu is a danger to the U.S., that the continued possibility that the Israeli right would provoke a regional war, which would not be in the U.S. interest. So I'm somewhat hopeful that she would shift the policy in such a way that Israel would be restrained. That said, that one cannot be optimistic that the fundamental issue of Palestinian self-determination, that there will be a solution, in our lifetime. I mean, that one has to assume that the situation will continue to get worse rather than better.
Well, the issue with that, of course, amongst Canadian social activists, that is top of the agenda is climate justice or climate change, and I guess there's a sort of forlorn hope that the United States would give up on this idea that it can maintain its strategic position in the world with all these additional military expenditures, demonizing China and Russia as nations that are a threat to it, when in fact it's the one threatening them, and turn its attention to the common security issue, which is, of course, climate change. In Canada, this past, I guess it was the last week or so, we've announced that we're joining the US in putting 100% tariff on imports of inexpensive electric cars from Japan. At the same time, we have a policy that, no combustion burning combustion engines will be sold after 2035 or something. So if you want an affordable electric car, it has to be Chinese. And the reason we're doing it is because we have a free trade agreement with the United States, and the Americans will accuse us of bringing in Chinese cars in the back door to the US. So is there any way that the American election will focus on climate change or any of the practical matters like transition to electric vehicles or any of the other concerns that are out there? Non-renewable energy sources are now much less expensive than they were 10 years ago, and they're much cheaper than fossil fuels. Trump, in his presidency, ruined the whole notion of solar panels, which was underway in the United States and the Southwest. To what extent is this an important issue in the U.S., the issue of climate change?
And I think it's a substantial issue, and particularly strongly felt by younger voters. And I think it's an area where Harris has a distinct advantage. The Biden administration's initiatives around climate were very, very substantial. I mean, that it's a complex program around a combination of tax measures and subsidies and grants and so forth, but that it represents kind of the largest climate initiative that I think any country has taken, with the possible exception of China. And the progress in terms of advancing renewables and so forth has been real. This brings us back to Bob's point, which is that the initiatives of the Biden administration, that were passed in 21 and 22, haven't had enough time to start having a real impact to change kind of voters' views at the grassroots. But they have made a very substantial start on a true climate change initiative. And obviously Trump would stop that in its tracks, and he keeps saying, drill, baby, drill. The denial of climate change is core to his political view. And that's another reason why the business community is split, because there are now very substantial business interests that are committed to the energy transition. So this is an issue that is powerful for Harris. I think that she's reluctant to kind of make it a top line issue because there are, for example, Pennsylvania, which is a state that's seen as the most critical state in terms of the election. Pennsylvania has had a large amount of successful fracking, of getting natural gas, and the interest in fracking extends across many communities in Pennsylvania. Harris had, in her earlier presidential campaign, said she was in favor of a fracking ban. She's now shifted that position. So too much talk about clean energy threatens votes in Pennsylvania, where fracking is popular among a significant number of voters. So this is kind of the complexity of the situation. But the reality is that the policies which are rooted in the Department of Energy, Department of Commerce, and so forth are solid policies, and there's every reason to believe that she would build on those in her own administration.
Peggy, do you want to comment on the issues in the blue wall states, the ones that the Democrats have to win? Are there issues on which that you wanted to raise around perhaps where the Harris campaign is going to have some problems or where they have some strengths?
Well, yes, I'd go back to Michigan, come back to my home state of Michigan, and to Bob's point about the reaction against what the Biden administration's blood on their hands with respect to Gaza. I think it was disgraceful, appalling, and absolutely inexplicable. Well, I'm sure it's explicable at some level, but politically idiotic. That they did not let one single Palestinian American, the person who was going to speak, the main person who was going to speak was an elected Democratic state rep from Georgia, a young woman whose speech was completely written in advance, was so tame. It was entirely a pro-Harris. We love Kamala. We have to vote for Kamala. Listed all these reasons, and then only sidled up to the Palestinian issue. It was extraordinarily mild-mannered, but they were so busy giving Republicans front row seats. Every Republican on the street that they could find, they put into prime time. Every CEO they could find, they put up there. They didn't have time or room. Of course, that was by calculation for one. I do not, Bob didn't talk about AIPAC, but I think the role of AIPAC is completely unappreciated in this calculation that they've made. AIPAC managed to get rid of two of the most popular members of the so-called squad. Michigan, when we're talking about Gaza, we have to remember we're talking about people who are not going to calculate, well, Trump is worse, so we're going to vote for Harris. It doesn't work that way. It's based on a sense of that voting is an expression of one's inner conscience. It's an expression of principle. People do not, when it comes to something so visceral, and when people's extended families are at stake, they do not do this kind of cost-benefit calculus and say, we're going to vote for Harris because she's still better than Trump. They say, I cannot violate my soul. I cannot violate my deepest principles and condone with my vote. So I fear that her terrible response in the CNN interview, which and what has just happened with the tragedy, the horror of the hostages, where each of these 6 hostages is humanized. We know their families, we know their personal histories, we know their children, their in-laws, we know where they went to school, we know everything about them. But 40,000 Palestinians are completely non-entities. Their deaths are spoken of in passive terms. They've died or they've been killed. Nobody talks about who killed them. Where did the bombs come from? This is a violation of people's of Palestinian soul. So I fear, I find it very emotional. I have a cousin who lives in Israel who's very, very opposed to Netanyahu. Incidentally, what's a curious thing about foreign policy is that it's arguable that Israel's own policies is affected by the American election, in that Netanyahu is so dedicated to getting Trump reelected that some people are saying that it's even more fortifying of his refusal to go along with a ceasefire because he doesn't want to give Biden the win, and which is very reminiscent of Nixon and the peace process in Vietnam being undermined that was strategically orchestrated to make sure that that the peace process was not consolidated under Humphrey. And it's reminiscent of Reagan orchestrating the hostage return during the Carter presidency, making sure that that didn't happen under Carter, that there are international collusions here. So it is true that getting the hostages returned would be seen, and the ceasefire would be seen as a victory for Biden. So Netanyahu is unlikely to let that happen. As for the blue wall states, yeah, I worry about Georgia for all of the election subversion issues that we've talked about. Something we haven't talked about at all enough, at least, is race. I would like to say one thing I think that's very interesting about what Harris is doing, and I see this as, I think it's successful, I think. So rather than putting her identity forward and speaking about racial justice and talking about breaking the glass ceiling and sort of advocating for what she obviously represents, she seems to be letting her being do the talking. In other words, just the fact that she is who she is, and we know who she is, and let Trump talk about her identity, and she says, next question, please. She is affirming her advocacy for racial justice simply by being Kamala Harris, rather than provoking the kind of identity politics craziness that happens when that is put forward explicitly. And so it's a very, very interesting strategy. And I think that this sort of being rather than doing and speaking it seems to me that it's successful because as a dedicated childless cat woman for Kamala, cat lady, I was one of, millions and millions of people on some of these Zoom calls. She obviously is generating massive, massive support from Black women and some Black men. And I think that has a lot to do with the way that she's managing this issue of racial justice.
We had a question in the chat. People can leave questions in the chat if they want about the Senate, which is kind of crucial. Do anybody have any comments on what the prospects are for the Democrats to win, and if they would they win because of the Harris? Is there a Harris Walz sort of bandwagon effect that's in place?
Yeah. Hello.
Yep.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about Walz. We haven't talked about Walz. To the extent that young men are inclined to vote Republican because of confusion about what it means to be a man in 2024, Walz is very good for that, in the sense that on the one hand, he represents a very traditionalist male narrative in benign form, football coach and National Guardsman. On the other hand, his governorship has been a very feminist governorship. It's been a very pro-family governorship. He bracketed a whole bunch of policies together in which he said, I want Minnesota to be the best state in the union in which to raise a family. And what does that mean? Well, it means great child care policies. It means paid family and medical leave. It means the most generous state level child tax credit. It means free school breakfast and free school lunch. So on the one hand, amid the concern that the Democratic Party has become almost too female a party in its themes, all of the caregiving themes, he is totally in that camp. But on the other hand, he represents at least a benign form of traditional masculinity. And I think of all the people who were in contention for the vice presidential slot, he was far and away the best one that Kamala could have picked. He's also very Midwestern. And that, speaking of the blue wall, that's very, very helpful in Michigan, Wisconsin, and also Western Pennsylvania, which effectively is part of the Midwest.
I'll jump in on the
Please, Fred.
Senate in that, as the question indicated, I mean, the map has always been very unfavorable to the Democrats, that they have a bunch of incumbents in red states or tightly contested states. But the polling data has been showing that many of these embattled Democrats, like Sherrod Brown in Ohio, are doing well, that they're 4, 5, 6 points ahead of the opponent. I think there's going to be a lot of ticket splitting, that some of the people kind of Nikki Haley Republicans who are voting for Trump with great reluctance will vote for a Democrat for Senate as a kind of insurance policy. So I think that there is a good prospect that some of those embattled Democrats will win. Many of them are very strong politicians, like John Tester in Montana, who's consistently won his seat in a state that's solidly Republican. The question, I think, pointed out that we're bound to lose the Manchin seat in West Virginia. I mean, he was a very unreliable Democrat who caused some of the worst cuts to the Biden initiatives. But there are a couple of places where a Democratic pickup is possible if Harris is running a strong campaign. Florida is one that comes to mind, where there is an abortion initiative on the ballot that's expected to pass, and their Republican senator is quite unpopular, and there's a Democrat candidate who's quite strong. She's behind in the current polling, but an upset victory is possible. So, I mean, that again, if the margin for Harris nationally is strong, one could expect the Democrats to be able to hold the Senate.
Bob, you've written about the role greed plays in public policy formation, particularly on the issue. Harris has made a specific policy proposal that people who have over $100 million be taxed on unrealized capital gains. And it's been ferociously opposed by, what is it, the 11,000 people who are in the category. Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is partly wanting to find a kind of brand of progressive populism that only hits the very, very filthy rich, to coin a phrase. But I think it's also the fact that they need revenue. I mean, the Trump, there's going to be a battle royal next year about how much of the Trump tax cut to rescind. And they have all of these plans to build houses and to restore the child tax credit. And that costs money. And so it's one part a salutary form of populism, but it's really one part the need for revenue. And if you need revenue, the best way to get revenue is to go where the money is and to tax the very, very wealthiest. Excuse me, but I'm having a computer problem. And if this persists, if this works, I'm going to have to sign off on the computer and then sign back on the iPhone. So if this doesn't work, this has been great. Thank you. And I hope it does work, and I'll see you again in a minute.
Okay. There is a sort of an old truism in political economy that the distribution of income and wealth cannot be separated from the production of income and wealth. Fred, does the Democrats, does the Harris Waltz campaign, did they have a wealth creation sort of program? Are they thinking in terms of how wealth would be created and distributed at the same time, in the same process, democratizing the economy, in other words? democratizing production?
Well, they're certainly not advocating worker control of industry, but that a part of what I've been working on over the last 10 or 15 years is the kind of federal role in the innovation economy and how central the federal government's role has been in developing new industries. And that set of initiatives has been greatly expanded under the Biden administration, that they've set up many new kind of research institutes that bring together public sector scientists with industry scientists to try to overcome technological barriers, develop new products, new processes, new industries. So they are, and the incentives, they've spent tens of billions of dollars encouraging, facilitating the production of cutting edge computer chips in the United States. They're heavily subsidized the development of clean energy and so forth. So they have had a very strong wealth creating set of initiatives, and the rate of small business formation, since many of these new technologies are started out by startups, that rate of small business formation has been increasing. And Harris today, I think, is about to unveil a new set of policies designed to facilitate and encourage small business creation, entrepreneurialism. And there, kind of one of the key things, which I think we've only mentioned in passing, is that the Biden administration has been aggressive in developing antitrust policies, in moving to break up the technology monopolies that big tech has, and appointing regulators who are committed to this. And that's extremely important because essentially in a whole series of industries, the very rich incumbents have been able to halt innovation by buying up challengers, by crushing challengers, and so forth. So the aggressive antitrust policy is central. There's been strong pushback against Harris. The billionaires are lobbying her to get rid of the head of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, who's the most articulate spokesperson for the antitrust agenda. But the same factors which Bob spoke about at the beginning, the influence of Elizabeth Warren on the Biden agenda, I think will continue with the Harris agenda. And Elizabeth Warren has been one of the main theorists of the antitrust push. And I think that will continue. So on the one side, using regulatory and legal action to restrain the big corporations, and on the other side, supporting small business entrepreneurs, innovation. That is, to my mind, the kind of correct 21st century wealth creation strategy.
I'd like to come back to what Peggy talked about earlier about the media. We have this situation whereby people like Trump give misinformation and it's reported as news. And there, I remember in when Sanders was a candidate, it was calculated that Trump had 100 times more television time than Sanders. Yet Sanders was doing quite well despite it. It's tied. The media, of course, is tied to funding. When I was a student in the United States in 1965, a fellow student explained electoral politics to me in the United States. He said the person who wins the presidential election is the one who collects the most money, and that seemed to have sort of worked out that you follow the money and you're going to find out who wins. Well, it is the amount of media buy, the amount of money that's available to the Harris Walz campaign, which seems to be quite significant. Is that going to be a really determining factor? Peggy, do you want to comment on that?
There's so much mixed data on the question of whether money is the determining factor or not. I'm not a political scientist, so I haven't got the figures in front of me. But there's no question that that in the first month that the enthusiasm for Harris was translated into this unprecedented $500 million dollars, which I think is itself unprecedented. So much so that she's now doling out money, which is good, to the down ballot races, the Senate races, House races, even some state races, which would be really, really important in places like Wisconsin, which has been ruled by a right-wing state legislature for so long. But this point about whether or not the split in the business class, I think, is relevant here in terms of fundraising. The so-called, Silicon Valley has moved decisively. Somebody is very much unmuted. So if everybody could mute themselves, there's a lot of strange noises coming across. Silicon Valley seems and the big tech seems to have moved very much into Trump's column, but there are still significant factions of big tech that are supporting the Democrats. The big one, I think, the big person is Reid Hoffman, who I forget what he founded, Netscape or Netflix, one of the big nets. But he is leading this pressure on Harris to get rid of the so-called billionaires' income tax, which, as you were saying earlier, affects all of 11,000 people. And the reason this is so significant, as Bob started to say before his own technology, which was probably, Reid Hoffman listening in and making sure that Bob's computer stopped working, is because in order to make the care economy possible, they're going to need that revenue. So it's not, and the billionaires say it's punitive. They they see themselves as the victims. But it's, and the question becomes, what do they do with all that money? Well, it's translated into power. It's translated into political power. And what I would like to suggest is there's been a lot of talk, and I think it's very, very interesting about how the Harris campaign has shifted the kind of zeitgeist of the campaign away from let's just talk about this policy versus that policy to this more general sense of her values and the whole emphasis on joy and positivity and looking forward. And a lot of people like George Lakoff, who is famous for talking about the importance of frames and emotions and values, is very, very happy about this. And in general, I think it's a very, very good thing. But what I find is missing, what I wish that they would do, and I know it's highly unlikely, is move to an even higher stratosphere and start talking about an economic bill of rights instead of saying let's help people with housing and let's help people with childcare and let's do the one policy after another. Why not put out a sort of FDR-ish statement that that economic security should be a right and create a sense of value and normativity, that this is a belief that even if one particular policy, they get criticized for her proposing a $25,000 grant to first-time homeowners. Well, rather than having to fight back and defend, why not put out a broader statement that there should be an economic bill of rights that Democrats should be in favor of? Yes, that's a provocation to the right. It's saying social, we believe in social democracy, but it's also a way to get people enthusiastic in a way that I am not convinced that the sort of policy wonkism can sustain. And I wonder what Bob and Fred think about that.
Can I jump in here?
Sure, Fred, please.
So, I mean, I think that relevant to the question of the role of campaign spending, and kind of orthogonal to Peggy's point, I think the election will be won or lost at the grassroots, and that there are across all of these battleground states all kinds of social movement groups that are registering voters, that are getting voters to the polls, particularly in communities of color, but in working class communities as well, white working class communities as well, that a lot of the outcome will depend upon the success of those kinds of groups in mobilizing their voters. And in some sense, the national campaign, what Harris proposes, is going to be secondary to this kind of mobilization at the grassroots in determining the outcome in these mostly extremely hard-fought states.
Well, I remember when Obama won in North Carolina, everybody was surprised, and the reason was that there was some Facebook groups that were set up by a vice president of Facebook, and people started meeting all over North Carolina who sort of felt excluded, and they got together for Obama, and Obama won the state. Bob, do you want to make
just two comments. If I can amend Peggy in one friendly way, I think it should be an economic bill of rights for the young. I think young Americans are particularly excluded from being able to own a home or affordable rentals or jobs with decent medical care or being able to attend college without being encumbered with debt. And given the fact that it's young men 18 to 29, who are being lost to Trump, you could pull them back with an economic bill of rights. With regard to Fred's comment, I do think, in addition to all the grassroots organizing that is being done, where Democratic infrastructure at the grassroots probably does have an advantage over Republican infrastructure, you still need a candidate about whom prospective voters are enthusiastic. And Biden agreeing to step aside in favor of Harris is hugely important in that regard, because no matter how good an army of poll workers and voter registration workers you would have had, they would have been dispirited, and the people they were trying to motivate would have been dispirited. And so now the potential of much better democratic organizing infrastructure, the grassroots, can be connected to enthusiasm for a candidate.
Agreed.
Well, I think this is our hour and a half, so I think we're going to conclude now. And I want to thank our panelists for what's been a most stimulating discussion. And I think I certainly have a better idea of the threat posed by the authoritarian state, neo-fascism in the United States, the form of this Christian nationalism as exemplified in the Vance candidacy, and the real difference that the Harris-Walz campaign provides, not just in the fact that we would have a Black woman president in the United States, but also a very socially progressive vice president. So that's a 1-2 punch that really means that this is a very serious choice that people have to make. And I'm glad that in our discussion today we were able to bring out the seriousness of what is actually at stake.